for joining us for today's webinar from near and far, particularly our speaker who is calling all the way from Japan. Before I turn things over to him, I just would like to note that the format for today's program will be a bit different from the conversation with series that we've been doing recently. We have an hour for today's program, and we'll be giving some extra time to our speaker to present a paper that he recently wrote for us on the topic of Russian interference in the U.S. alliances in Northeast Asia, which is, of course, the topic of today's discussion as well. The paper is now up on our website, and you can find it at keia.org. I'm sure many of you watching can recall the events of nearly a year ago, where a Russian military jet twice violated the airspace over South Korea's administered Dokdo Islands, which are also claimed by Japan, and resulting in an international incident between all countries involved. Since then, there has been much less in the news to remind us of Russian efforts to jostle U.S. alliances in Asia, but our speaker is now here with us to remind us and further shed light on how Moscow is attempting to sow divisions with U.S. alliance structures in Northeast Asia. And he's particularly well suited to do so. Dr. James Brown is an associate professor of political science at the Temple University Japan campus, where his research focuses on Russian foreign policy, especially Russian-Japanese relations and energy politics. He speaks Russian and Japanese and is also currently doing some research on countries spying on Japan. The way this will work, we'll turn things over now to Dr. Brown. He'll give his presentation, and that'll soon be followed by a period of Q&A. To help facilitate the Q&A, please send us your questions using the Q&A function built into Zoom as soon as they pop into your mind, so that we can jump right into the Q&A once Dr. Brown has finished giving his lecture. So now we'll turn things over to Dr. Brown to get us started.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity. So thank you very much to everyone at KEI, and thanks also to everyone joining this event wherever you might be. So I'm going to move directly ahead to sharing my screen, bringing up my slides for today. Okay, so the topic then, Russian efforts to weaken US-led alliance structures in Northeast Asia, putting a spoke in the wheel. So let's get straight down to it. So my thinking here in beginning this project is, as Carl mentioned, that we're all familiar with Russian activities elsewhere, allegations of Russia looking to undermine the ties of the Western alliance with military action in Europe, but then also support for far-right political parties, and then most notably, of course, with the interference in the 2016 US presidential election. However, much less attention is being given to Russian activities elsewhere, specifically in East Asia. So my question for this paper was a very simple one, simply to what extent is Russia engaged in comparable activities towards US allies in Northeast Asia, of course, meaning here South Korea and Japan. Now, to begin with, you might very well assume that they would be lower priority targets. I think that's certainly the case. You have that in Russian strategic documents, it's certainly NATO, which is regarded as the main direct military threat. So it's towards NATO countries that Russian activities would be concentrated. But another factor too is that whilst South Korea and Japan are themselves liberal democracies, they are not, they don't present themselves as being exporters of liberal norms in the same way that the EU or at certain times the United States has been as well. And so that means that again, perhaps Russia would not concentrate so much on South Korea and Japan as perhaps countries within Europe, within NATO. But having said that, there are very good reasons to believe that Russia would seek to weaken Japan and South Korea's alliance ties with the United States. After all, the United States has made it very clear that it considers Russia to be a strategic rival. And so for that reason, Russia would be looking for ways in order to weaken the United States. And a clear way of doing that is, of course, by picking away at the alliance ties, which is such a clear element of US strength internationally. Added to that too, the presence of US forces within South Korea and Japan, whilst they might be there primarily for other purposes, they're also in close proximity to Russian borders, making that a concern for Russia as well. Okay, so I think we can assume that Russia would be interested in this area. So to find out more about it, I divided it up into the four sort of classical departments of power, being diplomacy, information, the military, and economics. So I'll look at each of those in turn. Right, so to begin with then, it's the diplomatic area. Diplomacy is an instrument in its own right, but it's also important for setting priorities. So let's start here by looking at what would be Russia's priorities when it comes to South Korea and Japan. Well, we can divide this into long-term and shorter-term priorities. And the long-term priority would be to see those countries becoming increasingly self-reliant. So a Russian academic, Artyom Lukin, in a publication in 2019, had a look at some Russian academic writing, strategic thinking about South Korea. And one of the conclusions he draws, you can see there, the quotation there, the likely objective of Beijing and Moscow is, in his terms, Finlandization of South Korea, with him also saying that from the point of view of Moscow, South Korea would be seen as the weak link of the US alliance network in Asia. Similarly also with Japan, this from an interview with Sergei Naryshkin, who's the head of the SVR, the Russian External Intelligence Service, in an interview earlier this year saying, in his personal opinion, Japan should be a neutral country. So that would be seen as a long-term priority. I think added to that, you can understand why, from a Russian point of view, it would be advantageous if relations between Japan and South Korea are also tense. This being because if the US alliance structures within the region are really going to work to their full capabilities, it's helpful to have full trilateral cooperation. So any way in which tensions between Japan and South Korea can be further exacerbated, you could see that that would also be seen to be in Moscow's interests. Okay, so that's the long-term priorities, and I think those definitely are long-term. I don't think anyone in Moscow is so naive as to believe that the alliances are going to break down anytime soon. Rather, this is something that Russia would be looking to work away at incrementally over a long term to pull at the threads of this alliance and to gradually hope that they unravel. In terms of shorter term priorities, we have opposition to US missile defense systems within the region. And later on, I'll say a little bit more about the Aegis Ashore decision that Japan made earlier this week. But then going forward as well, a major priority for Moscow would be to oppose potential post-INF deployment of intermediate range missiles within the region. The US Defense Secretary said last year that he's looking to move forward with deployments within the region, and many people looking at Japan as a potential site for such missiles, albeit the Defense Minister Kono has denied that such talks are underway. So here we have some areas in which Russia would be looking to be active. Remaining in the diplomatic field, let's look now at some of the diplomatic activities that Russia has been engaged in. Now, diplomacy is always primarily words, and so let's look at the rhetoric here, and including some of the statements made by President Putin himself. Now, in order to encourage a shift towards increased self-reliance by both Japan and South Korea, you have the Russian side really trying to encourage, almost goad the leaderships in Seoul and Tokyo to move towards greater autonomy. So we have Putin lamenting South Korea's deficit of sovereignty. Also, when talking about the specific issue of missile defense, Putin again saying that US allies in this area don't have their own words or their own opinions. Added to that also, you have Russian officials really trying to push the narrative that the alliances with the United States are not actually serving those countries' national interests, because on key points of national interest, whether that is Korean unification or Japan's goal of a permanent seat in the UN Security Council, you have Russian officials saying that actually the alliances that those countries have with the United States are major obstacles to the achievement of those goals. And I include a bit more in the paper on that topic. But on the subject of diplomatic tools, I want to focus particularly on the territorial dispute with Japan. And I think really quite an active and quite effective way in which Russia has been able to use the territorial dispute. So it might be assumed that Russia would want to resolve and put an end to this dispute with Japan over the 4 islands off the coast of Hokkaido at the southern end of the Kuril chain. But I think actually, if you look at Russia's diplomatic activity in this area, you can put forward the argument that really this continued dispute serves Russian interests really quite well. Because by keeping the talks going and ensuring that they don't actually go anywhere, it gives Russia leverage over Tokyo. Because if Japan subsequently does anything which is not to the liking of Moscow, then they can always threaten to say, by taking this action, you are damaging our talks over the territorial dispute, you are leading them to be more unlikely to come to a successful conclusion. So I see this as very much a tool with which to manipulate Japanese foreign policy. And as I mentioned, it has been used by the Russian side with some success. And I point to the example of an agreement that was made in 2018, in November 2018, when Abe and Putin agreed to advance talks based on the 1956 joint declaration. We don't need to go into the specific details just now of that. We can in Q&A if you're interested. But the major point was that this gave the Japanese side renewed hope of some progress on this issue. But at the same time, the Russian side then pushed forward the idea that whilst they would like to make a deal, they see as a major obstacle the potential risk that US forces would potentially appear on any transferred territory. And so at that stage, according to Japan's Asahi newspaper, Putin was able to extract from Abe a promise that if the islands were ever to be transferred, then US forces would never be permitted to appear on that territory. So what I'm saying here is I don't believe that Russia actually has any real intention of transferring this territory, but what they're doing is using the hope of a deal in order to extract some promises from the Japanese side, in order to introduce a small bit of friction into the relationship with the United States. And so you can see there the use of a diplomatic tool to try and, as I say, introduce a bit of friction into the alliance. Okay, so that's diplomatic tools. Moving on to information tools. And within this quite large category can be included quite a number of things. Some very innocent, others a bit more controversial. But I begin with the innocent ones. Really, this is essentially public diplomacy that Russia conducts towards both South Korea and Japan, because as well as seeking to encourage those countries to distance themselves from the United States, to perhaps encourage a bit of anti-American feeling, the flip side of it is wanting to encourage the publics of South Korea and Japan to feel more positive about Russia. So in order to do this, Russia in recent years has been very actively engaged in public diplomacy towards both countries. These efforts have been ongoing for a number of years, but they've been especially intense just over the last couple of years. So last year being designated the year of Japan-Russia, huge number of cultural events taking place in both countries. This year is supposed to be the year of Japan-Russia interregional exchange and sister city ties, with an event planned to take place in Hokkaido. A lot of that's had to be suspended. But then also on the South Korean side, with plans for this to be the year of Russia-South Korean cultural exchange in order to mark 30 years of diplomatic relations. Some hopes of some of those events going ahead, but a lot having to be cancelled because of the pandemic. So really trying to draw upon Russia's strengths in high culture in order to improve the country's image. You also have things which are perhaps a little bit more controversial, and that is Russian state media in Japanese. Now, there is no Russian state media in Korean. That itself is interesting. They've obviously prioritized Japan in this regard, and they've gone with two outlets, Russia Beyond, which used to be known as Russia Beyond the Headlines, and then Sputnik Japan. You'll all, I think, be familiar with RT. There isn't a version of RT in Japanese. Instead, they've gone with those two publications, those two websites. Now, Russia Beyond is very much about promoting a positive image of Russia, encouraging an interest in Russian culture, encouraging tourism to Russia. So that really is not controversial. More interesting, I think, is Sputnik Japan. That is an outlet that has been subject to intense criticism elsewhere. President Macron, in particular, picked out both RT and Sputnik for criticism, describing them as essentially being outlets for Russian propaganda. When it comes to Sputnik Japan, however, they've played it very, very safe. I'd encourage people to have a look at the website if they're interested in Russian kind of media activities. It's very professional. It's very, very active, a huge number of stories appearing on there. It lacks obvious propaganda. It's different from some of the really blunt stories that people might be familiar with from RT. But if you look closer, you can see, for a start, of course, there are no negative stories about Russia, but there are also quite a few that you can see would be contributing to this longer-term goal of encouraging Japan to distance itself from the United States. So several articles about sensitive issues to do with the US alliance, such as the question of cost sharing, the issue of Osprey aircraft, which has been a sensitive one within Japan, but then also the one that I've picked out there on your screen. This is a screenshot that I took yesterday, which is highlighting the issue of the Henoko base, which is the planned replacement facility for the Tenma base, and is a very sensitive one within Okinawa. So you can see this is perhaps adding to Russian efforts in this area. On the flip side, you can also say that these are topics covered extensively in the Japanese media. They're clearly legitimate topics to cover, but nonetheless, why is Russia investing so much money in Sputnik Japan? Clearly, they want it to serve their foreign policy interests. So in conclusion, with Russian state media within the region, interesting that we have this focus on Japan, but at the moment, it seems to be quite a cautious approach, mostly about trying to build up readership and credibility, but perhaps also developing tools that can be used to greater effect in future. Okay, so that's public diplomacy. What about the really sort of juicy stuff of covert action, intelligence activity? Well, here I'm operating entirely with open source material, so it means that I'm limited in what information I have. So there's certainly interesting stuff that we can see that's historical, and I have more about Japan than I do about Korea. But we have information from some defectors, especially from a defector, Stanislav Levchenko, who defected from Japan, where he had been a KGB operative during the 1970s. And when he defected to the United States, he provided a huge amount of information about KGB goals and operations within Japan, highlighting that at that time at least, it was a clearly stated goal to provoke distrust between the United States and Japan in political, military, and economic arenas. So we can ask, to what extent have the intelligence services of Moscow changed? Does that remain one of their goals? We can also see that in the past, at least, the KGB had significant success within Japan. Again, according to Levchenko, saying that the KGB penetrated most of the major newspapers in Japan. Among agents of influence were a former cabinet minister, a prominent liberal Democrat, several high-ranking politicians from the Japanese Socialist Party, and important members of the academic, journalistic, and business communities. Levchenko also claims that the KGB were actively involved in encouraging protests against US President Eisenhower's visit in 1960, which had to be cancelled because of those protests. And also he says that the KGB were highly involved in many anti-war groups within Japan, using some of those as a front with which to encourage opposition to the Vietnam War and more broadly to the US presence. Okay, so that's historical stuff. Happy to talk more about that later on. But let's look at current activities. And here, I'm afraid I don't have, any real sort of smoking guns, but there are a few interesting things that we can look at. So one of the things that the Russian embassy here in Tokyo is very active with is engagement with political parties. And of course, this is what all diplomats do, all embassies do. It is part of their job. And Russia has been successful in negotiating a cooperation agreement between Japan's LDP and United Russia that was signed in April 2018. Perhaps a little bit more controversially, they have, it seems, some ties with a fringe nationalist group, the Isuikai. And so this might have some parallels with Russian ties, Russian support for far-right groups within Europe. So who are the Isuikai? Well, it's a very small group. It's one which says that it takes its inspiration from Mishima Yukio. Some of you who know your Japanese history will know he's a very famous author who then became increasingly radicalized and launched a military coup in 1970. After its failure, he then committed ritual suicide, but he's become revered by some right-wing figures within Japan, including by this group Isuikai. Isuikai claims that it wants to achieve Japan's independence from the United States and wants to reconquer Japan from US influence. And I should point out that this is a group that, whilst it could be described as anti-American, as to my knowledge, it's not involved in promoting any violent activity. So it's not so controversial in that regard. But it certainly does seem to have close ties with Russia. So the chairman of this small group, Kimura Mitsuhiro, has visited Crimea 10 times since 2014 and was also active in facilitating the visit by former Prime Minister Hatoyama to Crimea in 2015. He also writes quite extensively on the topic of Russia. The image I have there on the slide is a book that he was involved with, published in 2018, called Sugoizo Putin, which can be translated as essentially, Putin's amazing. That seems to be a group that Russia is certainly interested in. I wouldn't exaggerate its importance. This is a very small group. Most Japanese wouldn't actually have heard of it. Other activities, again, I don't want to say that these are anything particularly controversial. You have, however, some very notable interviews that have been given by prominent Russian officials, that one by the head of the SVR, Narishkin, where he actually got in contact with a Japanese journalist to offer the interview and then used that as an opportunity to encourage Japan to move, to distance itself from the United States, highlighted issues such as the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then another example being the interview by Sergei Glaziev, who at the time was an advisor to Putin, with the prominent newspaper in Okinawa, Ryukyu Shinpo, in which he again sought to really draw attention to sensitive issues related to the United States within Okinawa. But again, I mean, you can't describe these as covert activities. These are interviews which are open for everyone to see, but nonetheless interesting that it's clear that Russia's seeking to try and push ahead its favored narrative in this way. Now, finally, on the topic of intelligence officers, in the post-Cold War era, in both Korea and Japan, there have been a few cases. In the Japanese case, around 10. And the most recent of those was earlier this year, when it was alleged, certainly in the Japanese media, that the deputy trade representative in Tokyo, Anton Kalinin, who's pictured there in the middle of those three individuals, it was alleged that he had been seeking to purchase company secrets from SoftBank from one of their employees. The employee was arrested. The police within Tokyo sought to question Anton Kalinin, but he left the country before being questioned. And the Japanese media has since suggested that he was actually an SVR agent engaged in attempts to gain Japanese science and technology. Okay, so interesting points there within the information sphere. I'll now move on to the third main area, that of the military. What is Russia doing towards South Korea and Japan when it comes to military activities? So here, the main thing is military aviation, where you have really quite extensive activities by Russian military aircraft in the vicinity of both countries. And I think the aim here is twofold. Part of it is simply to test the air defenses of both countries, but there's also a more political element, which is reminding the countries that, look, we have the capabilities to do you harm. It makes sense for you to ensure that you have good relations with us. So Russian aviation, very active around Japan in particular. The Japanese Air Self-Defense Forces keep detailed records. And within the fiscal year of 2018, you can see there 343 scrambles were provoked by the approach of Russian aircraft, second only to those of the People's Republic of China. Now, I should point out that the vast majority of these do not involve violations of the airspace of either Japan or South Korea, but sometimes they do, with Japan claiming 2 violations of its airspace in June 2019. When it comes to Korea, the data was a little bit more difficult to come by, but there were 20 occasions between January and October 2019 when Russian aircraft entered the Korean Air Defense Identification Zone without prior notification. Another point is that this is something which the Russian side can ratchet up and down depending on whether they want to send a message or not. So in 2014, when Japan introduced sanctions on Russia after the Crimean annexation, there you saw quite a significant increase in the number of Russian aircraft operating around Japan. And here on this map, on the right-hand side, you can see the usual pattern of Russian military aviation, particularly active over the Sea of Japan, East Sea, but then also flying around all of Japan. The red lines here are Chinese aircraft operating in a slightly different way. But the really interesting event, this was the one mentioned by Kyle at the beginning, July 2019, where you had this incident, which was interesting for 2 reasons. First of all, it was the first joint air patrol between Russia and China within this area, where they entered into the Cadiz without prior notification, but then following immediately after that, you have this Russian aircraft here flying very deliberately around Dokdo Takeshima and then around again, prompting the South Korean Air Force to fire warning shots in response. So here, what was it that Russia was seeking to do? Well, perhaps it was in order to test air defenses, a practice known in Russia as cracking the hedgehog. But also, I think that very much this was looking to exploit the opportunity of tensions between Japan and South Korea. You will all know that in recent times, relations between Japan and South Korea have been very, very problematic. So I think that this was Moscow thinking, okay, well, let's see if we can exploit this situation further and stir up more difficulties between these two countries. And if that was the plan, well, it worked perfectly, because the main response from Japan, at least, was not to blame Russia, but rather to say to South Korea that you had no right to respond. And so I have the quote from Foreign Minister Kono, as he was then, saying to the South Korean side that it is Japan that should take action against the Russian plane. It is incompatible with Japan's stance that South Korea take steps on that. And so I think this really demonstrates the way in which tensions between Japan and South Korea provide an opportunity for other powers to really try and exploit those problems in the relationship. Okay, I'm mindful that I've been speaking for quite a while. I'm keen to get to your questions. So I'll just briefly mention economic tools as the fourth element of that DIME categorization. Here, however, I can move quite quickly because, frankly, Russia does not have a lot of leverage to use here in trying to prize the US allies from the alliance. You compare this, for example, with the People's Republic of China. After the THAAD decision, China was able to unleash significant economic punishment against South Korea, with the estimated cost in 2017 at $7.6 billion. Simply, Russia doesn't have that element of leverage to use. Some people might think of energy as being one potential source of leverage here. Not really. LNG works much less well as a source of foreign policy leverage than pipeline gas. In addition to that, the LNG market is very well supplied. Demand for energy has dropped, obviously, a great deal. This is not something that Russia can use in order to exert foreign policy influence. There were, in the past, talks about the possibility of gas pipelines from Russia to both South Korea and to Japan. I think these are extremely unlikely now. And so really within this area, Russia does not have a lot of leverage to use. Final point is that both the leaders of Japan and South Korea at the moment enthusiastic about closer ties with Russia, but here still, I don't see this as a source of leverage, not least because the companies in both South Korea and Japan seem a lot less enthusiastic about investing in Russia than do the governments of those states. Okay, so to bring this together, bring it to a close, I think that Russia is definitely seeking opportunities over the long term to weaken alliance ties between South Korea and Japan and the United States. However, whilst there are some definitely interesting things here, we shouldn't get too carried away. I see no evidence of election interference. I don't see evidence of widespread manipulation of social media that we've seen elsewhere. There have, however, been some wins. I think the Dokdo Takeshima incident was a success in showing how easy it was to exploit tensions between Seoul and Tokyo. When it comes to the governments of both countries, it's also a success for Russia that both governments are really quite pro-Russia, really quite enthusiastic about closer ties with Moscow. Now, did Russian activities, Russian pressure lead to Japan's decision to suspend Aegis Ashore earlier this week? I think that's probably too simplistic. I think the main reason for suspending that missile defense system is the reason that was given by the Japanese government, which is cost and also concerns about the technical capabilities of the system. But as a lower level factor, Russian pressure was perhaps a second order consideration, because Russia definitely was very strongly opposed to that system. However, when it comes to the overall picture, Russian activities haven't led to any major breakthrough. If you look at surveys of popular opinion, and the data I have on the slide is from Pew, from quite a recent survey, you can see that even despite the divisive administration in the United States, despite the problems that has created with alliance partners, you still have overwhelmingly the public within both countries expressing a favorable attitude towards the United States, a much more favorable attitude than they hold towards Russia. So finally then, what to watch? I think that Russian activity will continue within this area, especially when it comes to the potential for the deployment of intermediate range missiles within the region. And I'd also watch out for the potential for more cooperation between the PRC and Russia when it comes to weakening US alliance relations within Northeast Asia. Okay, I'm afraid I've spoken for a little bit too long there, so I'll end there and look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much for that, James. Really a great overview of your paper, which I would encourage everyone on here to read if they haven't done so already, and a good presentation, a good lecture in its own right. I want to turn now, I have my own questions, but I see a long queue of questions here coming in. So I'll turn to the audience first, but just as a reminder to everyone listening in, I see a lot of hands raised from participants. To ask questions, you'll need to actually type in your question via the Q&A function. We won't be turning to your video to give you an opportunity to ask the question. Rather, we'll be asking you to type it in. And as I mentioned, we have a few already that have been typed in and more coming in as I speak. So I'll turn now to our first question, which comes from someone from the National Institute for Defense Studies in Japan, who asks how interested really is Russia in Japan? If they were really if they were more interested in driving in the Japanese against the US, shouldn't we expect them to show a little bit more leeway on the territorial dispute? Instead, we kind of see redundant opposition to give away the land. To many Japanese, this person notes, it looks like simple indifference.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And first of all, hello to Yamazoe-san. Thank you very much for joining this. So I think that Russia has been really quite tough in recent times with Japan. That you can point to a number of steps that have been taken, the most recent of which being the inclusion within the revised Russian constitution of a clause kind of banning territorial concessions. So that seems a pretty kind of unfriendly step towards Japan. And yet at the same time, Russia continues with the talks. Russia could simply say, no, we're not going to talk about this issue at all. It is closed. They could even say much more clearly that there is no dispute whatsoever, in the same way that Japan says there is no dispute over the Senkaku Islands. They remain very happy to talk about this issue. They never actually give any ground. They also can be very tough on occasions, yet they still keep Japan's hopes just alive. And so my question would be, why do they do that? Why don't they just say it's closed? Because as far as I can see, the Russian side has no real intention of actually making a deal. So I think the reason for doing so is, as I say, because it's a useful tool of leverage. Abe, I think, will not be successful in his aim of making a deal. The next prime minister probably will learn from that experience and will not push so hard, will not invest so much time and effort. But ultimately, another Japanese prime minister at some point will come along and think that he or she will be the one to actually make a breakthrough. So I think that the territorial dispute actually serves Russia's interests. They have, as far as I can see, no interest in actually resolving it. Rather, they are very happy to keep the talks going indefinitely.
Thank you for that. Another question coming in asks about President Trump's recent decision to announce a reduction of U.S. military presence in Germany. Do you think this could foreshadow similar reductions of troop levels in Japan and South Korea? And if so, how does this change the calculus of the region from Russia's perspective? And I'll just add my own sort of thought on this too, or my own question that I had coming into this. What is really Russia's marginal influence in these relationships compared to more forceful negative forces pulling them apart from within each other as opposed from without?
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. So in terms of the extent of Russian influence, I suppose is what it comes down to. Yeah, it's not the top factor, is it? This is an additional factor. The main determinative factors here are to do with US politics. They're to do with domestic politics within Japan and South Korea that are completely separate from Russia. But Russia comes in trying to play a sort of multiplying role, to take tensions that exist already and to make more of them, to look for opportunities to exploit. So no, I'm cautious to ensure that I don't accidentally suggest that Russia's role is bigger here than it really is. But this is something which comes on top of many, many other factors. Now, when it comes to the issue of force reductions, now, we first of all have to take into account that these are things which take place over a long period of time. And we don't know whether the Trump administration is essentially going to be in office for another few months or potentially years beyond that. If it's years beyond, then yes, this issue of troop reductions, force reductions will be very much a major issue. If it's not, if there's a change of administration, then I think that some of the most direct, forceful, and frankly threatening issues to do with force reduction will go away. Especially because, as far as I see it, the presence of US forces within the region, whilst it is to the benefit of the host countries, it is enormously to the benefit of the United States itself. And those who work within the strategic community of the United States will be aware of this, and they would be very active in resisting force reductions that would, on a surface level, be advantageous, but would actually do enormous damage to the US presence within the region.
Thank you for that as well. A question here about what's been going on the Korean Peninsula from So-Young Kim from RFA, who asks, what would Russia's stance be on the latest developments on the tensions between North and South Korea? Moving forward, would Russia want to take more of an active role engaging, such as being at the table and resuming the six-party talks? Or is this something that they're willing to take a seat, back seat to the rest of the region and handling the situation?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so Russia's position here is, first of all, yes, it definitely wants to be involved. We've had several indications of that. If I remember correctly, Matvienko, the head of the Russian Senate, has visited North Korea. Lavrov has visited. We also had Kim Jong-un, of course, visiting Vladivostok. Russia certainly wants to be involved. I believe there's perhaps been a slight change of emphasis, though, from the Russian side. In recent times, it seemed to be the Russian position that they wanted North Korea and the United States to engage in talks, first of all, and then only afterwards, after some progress was made there, that it would then be expanded to the six-party format. From Lavrov's most recent comments, however, it seems that there's maybe been a little bit of a change here, and he seemed to be encouraging a direct move immediately to a six-party format, perhaps in recognition that talks between the United States and North Korea are going nowhere, and so it would make sense to multilateralize it at an earlier stage. When it comes to Russia's broader position, however, they clearly want to achieve more stability here. There is no interest for Russia in having a crisis on the peninsula. I am sure that their offers to play a constructive role here are genuine. They do not want a crisis on their own border. And also, if there were to be a real success in reducing tensions, it would be to great economic benefit for the Russian Far East. And so I think Russia certainly does want to be an active and constructive partner when it comes to the Korean Peninsula.
Well, staying on the peninsula, another question here asks, if the prospect of a unified neutral Korean peninsula would become possible, what would the attitude of Russia be to this? Would this be something Russia could support, and what factors would it want to take into consideration?
Yeah, another very good question, and I think Russia is, they're certainly not naive. They know that this is not coming anytime soon. But in an ideal world, they would love to have an integrated Korean peninsula, and the reason for this is because at the moment the Russian Far East finds itself certainly somewhat cut off from South Korea. If you have an integrated peninsula that has all sorts of potential for increased railway connections, for energy connections, this would link Vladivostok, the broader Russian Far East, to ports in South Korea. It would be hugely beneficial for Russia's integration into Northeast Asia more broadly. So yeah, I think that Russia is a major supporter of this, and is also perhaps more relaxed than China is about the top. China, of course, worried about what regime, what government, what sort of system a unified peninsula would be under, certainly what that would mean in terms of US forces. Yeah, I'm sure that's a concern for Russia as well, but they seem to be much more focused on the potential for infrastructure projects. They were very enthusiastic about President Moon's suggestions, his northern policy, his 9 bridges strategy, hoping that that could lead to benefits for the Russian Far East. Of course, a lot of that is now seeming a lot less likely.
We have another question asking, what do you think about the amendments to the Constitution that are going to be held on July 1st in terms of 1, the territorial dispute, and 2, relations with South Korea?
Yes. So in terms of the constitutional revision, it includes this clause which bans territorial concessions, but then it also includes some language saying that it would be acceptable to have territorial delimitation. So basically, I don't think it makes a great deal of legal difference. I don't think it really needs to be there in order to protect the Southern Kuril Islands from being transferred to Japan. That wasn't going to happen anyway. That doesn't need to be in the Russian constitution in order to prevent it. But it does make a difference politically. The reason why it's there, I believe, is because it's to drum up patriotic support for this constitutional revision, the main goal of which is in order to reset Putin's term limits. So that, along with some other of the changes, are really in order to generate more support. When it comes to the constitution and Korea, perhaps I'm missing some element, but I don't see anything there that would be of particular concern to South Korea. By all means, if you want to come back with an additional question there, do so. But at the moment, I don't see much relevance there for Korea.
Thank you again. Next question, or is more of asking you to comment on something, comes from our friend and colleague Gil Rosman, who asks, hasn't the Russian image deteriorated as of late? Russia is being seen as too close to China now. Russia's breaking sanctions on North Korea. Is Russia's strategy failing? I guess, how does changing perceptions of Russia right now in terms of its broader standing really impact its ability to have influence with these actions?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for for the question. So Russia's image has it found some success? I don't see that it has found success really. That all of those cultural activities, I'm sure that that has led to a greater appreciation of Russian culture. But does that in turn lead to a broader appreciation, a broader liking of Russia and its politics? No, I don't think so. The spy scandal earlier this year got very wide coverage within the Japanese media and feeds more broadly into very well established images of Russia as a threatening northern neighbor. This is something which Russia is seeking to erode, but I think it remains the case within Japan. I've asked people in Korea about the widespread image of Russia there. It's perhaps a little bit different. I think that the visa waiver system that was introduced was really quite successful in introducing much greater exchange between South Korea and in particular the Russian Far East. That's perhaps contributed to a more positive image, especially among young South Koreans. But again, when it comes to the key geopolitical issues, I don't think Russia is seen as being in a favorable light. And as Gil suggests, Russia's increased closeness to China will potentially then add to a negative image.
Another question asks, you mentioned watching Russian reactions to a post-INF missile situation. Could you please give some possible reactions to what how Russia will react based on different US decisions with the INF?
Yeah. It really depends what the US does. And there are still at this stage a lot of different options. So when we're looking at East Asia, we know, as I mentioned, the US wants to install additional missiles within the region. Of course, they gave Russia as the reason for their withdrawal from the INF. I don't think many people buy that as the main explanation. This is primarily to do with China. So that means, freed of the INF, the US will want to position more missiles, more intermediate range missiles within the region. But within that, there are still lots of different options. If we're talking about true intermediate range missiles, then Guam is a possibility. That's still within range, but that then makes Guam very much a target for Chinese missiles. And if you want shorter range cruise missiles, they need to be closer. And so you look at the geography of the region, and that means that they're essentially going to have to look at opportunities within Japan and within South Korea. I think the reaction within South Korea would be very, very strong. I might even remember correctly, the South Korean government has already ruled that out. So then we're really just looking at Japan. But there's also the possibility that they could go instead for some form of Japanese enhanced capability rather than actually having US missiles. So at the moment, everything is open to interpretation. And as I mentioned, Defense Minister Kono has said that talks with the United States about this aren't even taking place. So a lot remains to occur. And Russia's response will depend on what the United States does. So if the US were to take a very aggressive stance and to position an extensive number of missiles which put Russian territory in range, then we can expect Russia itself to position more missiles in the vicinity of Japan, perhaps in Kamchatka, perhaps on the Kuril Islands themselves. If it's a smaller response by the US, then Russia's own response will be lower key. So really, we have to wait here. But this is a major, major priority for Russia. It is going to respond, and it might also coordinate its activities with China.
Before we conclude, I wanted to ask a question of my own, one in which your paper hints at, and as well as you just sort of mentioned, the prospects for China, Russia cooperation in relation to influencing U.S. aligned structures in Northeast Asia. On the one hand, in your paper, you talk about the ability of the two sides to sort of specialize in their respective strengths. China maybe more so on the economic side, and Russia more so on the intelligence, military, diplomatic leverage side. But then you also talk about maybe because of Russia's close cooperation with China, it may be able to lose some of its veneer as a partner to, as its ability to have legitimacy to take some of these actions. So how do you sort of balance the two moving forward? How does this dynamic work, especially as we see more signs of China and Russia working closer together?
Yeah, well, they definitely have shared interests here. You know, on the broader issue of US alliances, but then also these specific issues to do with missile defense and post-INF missiles. But I think the most likely thing we would see is coordinated activity rather than true cooperation. So I don't think we're going to see some, you know, joint kind of activity by the intelligence services on both sides, but rather it could well be increased kind of military coordination, also the potential coordination of some military activities with economic pressure from China. And we've seen a little bit of this already after THAAD and that issue in South Korea. China and Russia responded by announcing increased cooperation when it comes to missile defense research. But I would point out that the relationship between China and Russia is far from smooth. There is still the issue of a lack of trust between the partners. And earlier this week, as some of you might have spotted, there was a spy story between China and Russia, with a Russian official being prosecuted for selling secrets to China. So that indicates that whilst their intelligence services might be active towards US allies within the region, their intelligence services are also active against each other. So that means that it won't be that smooth for China and Russia to coordinate in this area.
Well, James, this has been such a very interesting and engaging hour of discussion. I know we have 2 minutes left, so rather than end a little bit early, I wanted to see if you had any parting thoughts or last concluding things that you want to impart on any of our listeners listening in right now.
Well, I think one point to make is that Russia doesn't always have the best cards to play, but it can also often be very effective in using what it's got, making the best of the situation and looking for opportunities. So if you are a supporter of US alliance relations within the region, you have to minimize those opportunities. And so that means that when any of the sides are taking action that are leading to increased frictions, that are leading to tensions, whether that's between the US and its partners or between Japan and South Korea, that is an opportunity for Russia. It is an opportunity for other countries to exploit, and often they're very effective in doing that. And so I know that emotions run very high, but there, I hope, is an appreciation of the extent to which these inter-alliance frictions are a real opportunity for other countries.
That's definitely something to keep in mind, especially as there's just so many milestones coming up in the US-Korea, US-Japan relationships, particularly surrounding the special measures agreements for each country, and contextualizing it in the Russian ability to enhance interference really provides a stark backdrop for those talks as well. And as I mentioned, this has been a fantastic an hour. Really has flown by. I'm really looking forward to reading more of your research, and I thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.